Okay, so once again, we're in another in this series of Bible stories we think we know. Just to repeat, the original intention of this thing has always been to re-examine some very well-known Bible stories, things we tend to sort of gloss over and think, well, we've read that 100 times, we know what the message is, we know what the moral is, and look if there isn't perhaps something a little bit more we can take away from each of these. And in this case, we're looking at the story of the rich young ruler. But just before we get there, just to sort of set the scene, in my mind, one of the greatest ironies of the last 12 months has been this, COP26. First of all, because it's number 26. In other words, for 26 years, these bozos have gathered at great expense to do very little other than talk a lot of hot air and cause more global warming. And of course, that was one of the problems with the whole thing. Good old Joe Biden probably single-handedly contributed more to CO2 emissions than I will in my entire lifetime. And no other world leader was really any better. But perhaps the greatest irony of all is that it will achieve almost nothing. Within a matter of weeks of this conference that was supposed to revolutionise the world, the EU agreed to meet their green targets by simply renaming gas and nuclear power as green. And there you are, you see. Almost all of our generation is now via green sources. Yeah, right. But it put me in mind of something a number of years ago. A friend of mine, a local farmer, wanted to build a solar farm on one of his fields. Okay, so he put in his planning permission. And the site was excellent. It was in a side valley off from the Team Valley. It was not overlooked by anybody. It wasn't going to cause any inconvenience to anyone. And he furthermore had a genius idea. He ran rare breed sheep, and apparently this particular breed dropped dead at the first sight of sunshine. So his plan was to have these solar panels put in, but raise them up off the ground a bit further so his sheep could run in the field, keep the grass down, and shelter from the sun whenever it shone. Unfortunately, you can imagine, in a place like the Team Valley, a great many NIMBYs. Nobody wanted this thing to go ahead, and there was an incredible amount of objection to it. So I rather went into bat for John. I wrote letters to the council in support of the thing, and I engaged with Facebook groups and so on that were set up, just trying to put a different point of view. Anyway, there was one particularly vociferous lady who was all against this, and it was terrible, and it would desecrate the sacred Team Valley. I don't know what, I'm exaggerating slightly. Anyway, in an exchange with her, I said, there is something I know that we could all do which would prevent this from going ahead. Oh, really? She said. Yeah, guaranteed. I said, we can absolutely dead certain prevent this from happening. Really? What is it? Can you tell us? In public? I said, yeah, sure. So it's very simple. I said, throw away your iPhone, scrap your dishwasher, and don't use your tumble dryer. And if we all did that, the demand for electricity would drop, and there would be no financial case for building another solar farm. And that was the end of the conversation, because it turned out that even when the answers to some of these things are really very simple, no one's actually willing to do them. And that, of course, brings us back rather nicely to our story, which we do know is the story of a young man who was given the answer to his question, but wasn't quite willing to do what he needed to do. So let's just recap the story quickly from Mark's telling of it. As Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. "Good teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "Why do you call me good?" Jesus answered. "No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not defraud. Honour your father and mother." Interestingly, that Jesus made no comment on the first 4 commandments, but rather focused in on the ones which have to do with the way people treat one another. "Teacher," the young man declared, "all these I have kept since I was a boy." Jesus looked at him and loved him. "One thing you lack," he said. "Go, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." At this, the man's face fell, and he went away sad, because he had great wealth. Okay, that's the story. So let's unpick it a little bit and find out something about this young man. First of all, he's described as young. And apparently, the word used in the Greek is specifically referring to someone in this age group between about 24 and 40. So he's an adult, but he's certainly not old enough to be considered a patriarch or anything. He's a young man. Secondly, the conclusion to the story tells us that he was very wealthy. We're not told how he had accumulated this wealth. Was it inherited? Was it family wealth? Was he himself a banker or trader or something? We just don't know, but he was wealthy. He was also pious. We're told, he claimed of himself, in fact, that he had always kept all of the religious rules expected of a good Jew. So he was a pious religious man. He was, in fact, a religious ruler. Now, when it talks about him in one of the other Gospels as being a rich young ruler, this isn't obviously someone in cahoots with the Romans. This is probably a synagogue ruler such as Jairus, the man whose daughter fell ill and Jesus healed, in fact, restored to life. This would be someone who's a ruler among the Jews, as I say, likely a synagogue ruler or something like that. And there's more we can tell about this young man, because we can conclude that he was almost certainly a Pharisee. First of all, because he believed in the resurrection and eternal life, whereas the other major religious group, the Sadducees, did not. Now, for this young man to have become a ruler among the religious leaders of the day, he must have aligned with one or the other group, and in this case, clearly he was aligned with the Pharisees. Secondly, his focus on obedience to the law of Moses tells you something about the fact, again, that he aligned himself with the Pharisees. And then finally, this belief, implicit in what he said, that eternal life could be achieved by doing something. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Once again puts him very squarely in the camp of the Pharisees. Now, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to the story, but it does help us understand the background and where this young man is sort of coming from in a cultural and religious sense. What's interesting about the story is that when he came to Jesus, his question, what must I do to inherit eternal life, was not one of those sort of awkward questions or troublemaking questions that Jesus typically had to deal with. You know the sort of things. People came to Jesus and said, tell us, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And they didn't really care. They didn't want to know. What they were hoping to do was cause trouble, because if Jesus said no, then they'd go and report him to the Roman authorities. And if he said yes, well, they'd have caught him out there as well then, because he was clearly in cahoots with the Roman authorities, you know. Or, of course, the example of the woman caught in adultery. And the very pious people who caught her brought her to Jesus and said, should we stone her to death? The law of Moses says we should. And again, they were trying to trap Jesus. If he said yes, go ahead, stone her, of course, they'd run off and report him to the Roman authorities, because he was taking the law into his own hands, which he had no right to do. If he said no, then he was effectively making the law of Moses of no account, and so they were hoping to trap him either way. But this young man's question was not like this. This young man's question was serious. He wanted to know the answer. And of course, it's an interesting approach from a young Pharisee to come to Jesus and call Jesus a good teacher. Because as far as the Pharisees were concerned, Jesus was anything but. Repeatedly they accused Jesus of Sabbath breaking, healing people on the Sabbath, and so on. They accused him of claiming the right to forgive sins, a right they believed belonged to God alone. And of course they didn't accept Jesus as being God. So again, for a Pharisee to come to Jesus and call him good teacher is quite remarkable. And of course, one of Jesus' major sins, according to the Pharisees, was desecrating the Sabbath by allowing his disciples to pick wheat. And so again, calling him good teacher reveals quite a lot about this young man's attitude. He may have been a Pharisee, but he certainly wasn't run-of-the-mill, unthinking, unquestioning, bound by the traditions of the Pharisees. He was a bit more serious, and a bit more serious in his faith as well. And so he comes to Jesus and he says, "What must I do?" See, for all his piety, for all his wealth, and the comfort, and the social position of being a religious ruler, he clearly felt that something was missing in his life. And so he came to Jesus, this good teacher. Perhaps he'd observed him for some time. Perhaps he'd heard stories. We don't really know. But one way or another, he thought Jesus might have the answer to his question. What must I do to inherit eternal life, to be assured, to feel safe, to feel secure in the hope of eternal life? Now, Jesus' answer was harsh. Sell everything, give to the poor, and follow me. And immediately there's a problem with this, which is that some people will tend to take the least little bit, particularly conservative Christians, will tend to take the least injunction or instruction given in the Bible and make it normative. Aha, you see, Jesus told this man to do this, therefore we all should. And I want to just digress for a moment and make the point that this is not the way we should be interpreting the Bible. Back in Deuteronomy, and I know this is referring to a legal situation, but it says this: a matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, Paul used this over in the New Testament to describe discussions, or debates rather, in church. Every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so when we come to a situation like this, we would expect, if this statement, sell everything, give to the poor, was meant to be normative, we would expect to find it recounted in the Gospels, and then perhaps we would go over to one of the letters of Paul to the churches, where he's perhaps telling them off and saying, "Why haven't you all sold everything and given it to the poor?" And perhaps we'd expect to find a third testimony from perhaps James saying, "You will know you're a true Christian when you have given everything away, when you've sold everything and given it to the poor." But of course, we don't find that to be the case. And so we have to accept that this instruction was unique to this particular person and this particular situation. And there are many other examples in the Bible where some injunction was given uniquely to a particular person. As I said, the danger is that there have been, schisms within churches where somebody is seized on one unique standalone piece of advice and said, "Aha, we all have to do this," and in the inevitable disagreement that follows, churches have split up. We need to be wise about this and look for these 2 or 3 witnesses to each matter. However, there's more we can say about this, because it's quite interesting to note that shortly after this exchange, which clearly the disciples had listened in on, Peter went to Jesus and said, "Well, what about us? We've left everything to follow you." In other words, we've done what you just told the rich young ruler to do. But that wasn't strictly true, was it? I mean, yes, when Jesus called Peter to leave his boat and his nets, he did so. But Matthew recounts how on one occasion Jesus and the other disciples went to Peter's house. Now hang on a minute, Peter. I thought you'd left everything. Only it turns out that Peter has a house. And it turns out that in this house there was a mother-in-law. And generally speaking, where one finds a mother-in-law, one finds a wife. And generally speaking, where one finds a wife, one finds children. And so although it was true of Peter that he had in fact walked away from his boats, his livelihood, he'd not exactly divorced the house and sold the wife. He still had his little patch of domestic bliss to go home to. But Jesus was willing to accept that from Peter. Interesting. Now here's another similar kind of situation. We all know the story of Zacchaeus, the little man, the tax collector, the one who couldn't see Jesus over the crowd and so climbed up a tree. There's an interesting parallel here, of course, with the story of the rich young ruler, because here was a wealthy man who nonetheless felt such an emptiness or a vacancy in his life and went looking to Jesus to fill that. Now the story is, of course, as we all know, the children's song, Jesus and Zacchaeus went back to Zacchaeus' house, and they had a meal and they had a conversation. And at the end of it, Zacchaeus said this: "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay back 4 times the amount." Notice the similarities again. He's very, very quick to give away half of his possessions to the poor. By the way, we've always seen Zacchaeus as being an inveterate cheat and liar and making most of his wealth out of overcharging people. But a simple bit of mental arithmetic will tell you that isn't the case. If he could give away half of his wealth and then out of the remaining half pay back everyone he's cheated 4 times over, a basic bit of mental arithmetic tells you that less than 10% of Zacchaeus' wealth had come from cheating people. Right? Clearly the rest of it he'd earned by legitimate means. It just gives a slightly different flavour to the story, doesn't it? But the thing is this, that while the rich young ruler turned away sad, Peter, who hadn't given up everything, was told, "You will receive 100 times as much in this present age, and in the age to come eternal life." And Zacchaeus was told, "Today salvation has come to this house." Isn't that interesting? So clearly there's no sort of magic associated with the business of giving away everything, selling everything and giving to the poor. It seems to be quite individual. Different expectations for different people, for different situations. As we said, sadly, this young man turned away. Why? Well, because he stood to lose his comfort, his prestige, his social position. And you see, often the truth is it's not really about money. I mean, money's just numbers on a computer screen, isn't it, really? It's what that money buys you. It's the prestige. It's the thought that people are looking up to you. That's what he really didn't want to lose. Of course, what he stood to gain was eternal life, but apparently at that moment in time, that was not so valuable to this young man, and so he turned away sad. See, the truth for this young man was that he had fallen foul of the first of the 10 Commandments, which says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And that doesn't necessarily refer to images. It doesn't necessarily mean pagan gods or something like that. What it means is anything that comes between us and our commitment to God. Unfortunately, what this young man proved to us is that it's just as possible for possessions or career to become the most important thing in our lives as it is for some other pagan god to become the most important thing in our lives. And so this young man was guilty of idolatry, even though he was a pious Jew and would never dream of bowing down to a pagan image. He had let something else get in the way between him and God. And the way it looks for us is simply this. I wonder if there are areas of our lives where we, whether explicitly or implicitly, say, "Well, I would, but." "Well, I would get more involved in church, but." "Well, I would attend church every week, but." "Well, I would get to church on time, but." "Well, I would give more generously to the church or to charity, but." And each one of those buts is, on its own, usually something that's perfectly legitimate, perfectly reasonable, perfectly natural to want. But the problem is, it's something that's coming between us and God, between us and our religious observance and our commitment. Remember this injunction: "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." The question is, as we move into this new year, is there anything getting between me and God this year? Is there anything God might be calling me to give up in order to improve our relationship? My prayer is that if there is any such thing, we will be willing to do whatever it takes to get that thing out of the way and commit fully to our relationship with God.